Good afternoon, and thank you all to join me today. I will, in the next 20 minutes to 30 minutes, try to give you a sense of what is happening in the world of refugees and persons displaced by violence or by natural disaster in 2016, how we at Refugees International decided to address that, and what is the outlook for 2017. So first, to put things in context, this is how the number of people displaced by violence has evolved over the past 5 years. You see a very sharp rise, and it is still on the rise. This includes refugees and people displaced within their own countries. And with the 65 million that are displaced at present, about a third are refugees, which means they've been able to cross a border to seek protection in the neighboring countries, sometimes further along, and the others are displaced in their own countries. There are different issues when we look at how to respond to them. I mean, their needs tend to be very much the same. These are people who've lost everything. But for refugees, they tend to be in places that are easily accessible to humanitarian agencies that want to assist them and to protect them. And they are covered by a series of international instruments that at least allow us to follow a little bit the accountability of governments that oversee them. When it comes to IDPs, they are displaced very often in areas of their country where the conflict still rages. They are much more difficult to access, and access is sometimes constrained by very serious security consideration, where very often foreign entities will be unable to go or able to go at tremendous risk to themselves. And then there are no international serious human rights instrument to protect them. There are a series of international norms that have been promoted, but they don't have the same strength in international law that the instruments that protect refugees have. So they are much more vulnerable. They're also much more fluid population to track, because when they decide to go back home, usually it's not as easy to monitor and register as it is for refugees who have to cross a border back home. So where are these people? You see that people are displaced by conflict in their own countries. It is mostly the Middle East and all the part on the Central African band that we see there. Colombia, you will see on part of South America, is the oldest displacement and the largest displacement. Many have been displaced for many years, and though we still count them as displaced, for all practical purpose, some have settled permanently in the areas where they have been displaced. In the Middle East, the displacement remains extremely acute, as it does in Africa. When it comes to refugees, people who have crossed the border, where do they come from? The largest refugee-producing countries are Somalia, Afghanistan, and Syria. And on the table close to that, you see which are the countries hosting them. And if you put these figures on a map, you have that result. And it's quite interesting, because when you consider all the extremely negative narrative about refugees in the West, whether this is in North America, in Europe, in Japan, in Australia, they are not anywhere close to the countries that host a larger number of refugees. And it makes this negative narrative slightly irrelevant when we look at what the needs are and how we should respond. And finally, if we look at what happened in 2015, where most of the displacement occurred in 2015, you will see that most of the displacement resulting from conflict has occurred in Africa and in the Middle East, as I was mentioning before. And here I would like to ask Ukraine. The situation is quite tense down there. And most of the displacement resulting from natural disasters has occurred in Asia. Today, we estimate that there is an average of 26 million people displaced by disasters every year. And it seems that this number is increasing quite regularly and is becoming a major concern for the international community, because we're not well prepared to address that. So where did we go in 2016? There on that map you can see which countries we covered, and somehow you will see that it matches pretty well the maps I have showed you before. We have tried to be responsive in all the continents where there have been large-scale displacement, whether internal displacement or across borders. I should have told at the beginning that if you have questions, you are welcome to write them in the bottom box to the left, and I will pick them up after the presentation and be very glad to answer them. So if you have questions coming as I'm speaking, please write them down, and they will certainly not be lost. So the largest crisis today is, of course, Syria. There are about 8 million people who've been displaced within Syria, and about probably more than 4 million that have moved out and are refugees in neighboring countries or who have moved further into Europe. That means 60% of the Syrian population has been displaced over the past 6 years, some more than one time. We did cover the Syrian crisis quite intensely over the past 5 years. We addressed the problem of how to treat the ladies who had been victims of gender violence. We have pushed the UN to be much more active in covering the people who were in an urban setting and who were not in camps, which is the majority of the Syrians. We have pushed very much the US government to increase cross-border assistance inside Syria. And this year we went to Turkey to look at the recent offer by the Turkish government to offer work permits, a very critical issue to allow the refugees to become self-sufficient, and to see what were the opportunities and the weaknesses in that offer. We have also gone to Greece, because as you know, in 2015, there was a large movement of Syrian refugees toward Greece and trying to move further into Europe. About 1 million have reached a series of European countries, Germany mostly, but also Sweden and quite a few others. And we wanted to see a little bit what was happening in Greece as a result of an agreement between Europe and Turkey that has been quite dramatic in terms of reverting long-standing policies to protect refugees. So we went to Greece this year, and we were quite stricken by the fact that apart from Syrian, as the movement of Syrian grew towards Europe, many other groups of refugees started joining them. And one of the groups who were particularly taken about were Afghans. Afghans, as I mentioned before, is the second refugee-producing country in the world. The situation in Afghanistan is not getting better. There's a large number of people who are displaced within their own country with very little assistance reaching them. The Taliban have gone more aggressive and control more territory over time. And we found Afghans, in this case in Thessaloniki, in northern Greece, who were living in abandoned buildings, were still hoping to move towards Europe, though the borders have been closed and they would have to resort to more complicated smuggling mechanism. And just a picture I would have loved to see us was of a little girl whom we met in this place and who interpreted for us. And she had been on the move for 9 months with her family from Afghanistan, and she had learned English sufficiently to be able to translate for her family for us. She had learned English on Google Dictionary during her ordeal fleeing Afghanistan through Iran, Turkey, and then through the boats that took her to Greece. And when at the end of a very nice conversation, we asked her, "Can we take your picture?" She said no. And we asked why. Well, they do know that the Afghans are at a very serious risk of being returned to Turkey or eventually returned to their own country. And she said, if we are returned and the Taliban see my picture was taken, I would be in trouble. And this is the sort of preoccupations that is in the mind of this little girl that have been 9 months on the road to find some safety. We were then in Greece on some of the islands very close to Turkey. Now you can see in the horizon, this is the Turkish coast, and this is a pretty narrow stream of water that I think in my younger years I could probably swim, and people are dying crossing that stretch of water because the smugglers are so cynical that they overload very, very leaky boats to try to send them across. And when they arrive in Greece, these are these igloo tents where people have been staying in for months without better shelter, without better accommodation, without better safety for their children who can access the water. And this is what was extremely disturbing in Greece, to see that in a European country that where you have quite a bit of EU money available, people who are stranded now cannot move forward because the borders with the rest of Europe have been closed, are kept in these absolutely pathetic condition. And certainly the lessons that we have learned this year is that European bloc, which has been the source of international refugee law, has established principles on how to treat refugees properly, has reneged completely on this principle to gather along some sort of unity by basically saying refugees out. And most of these people are now under threat of being returned to Turkey, or I mentioned further away. I will briefly address the situation of Somali refugees. We made a webinar on Somali refugees recently, and it's available on our YouTube page, but very briefly, because it illustrates the impact that policies in the West might have. Kenya, who hosts a large number of Somali refugees in the Dadaab refugee camp, has decided to close the camp and to send them back to Somalia, though Somalia is still a country in the hands of extremist group Al-Shabaab, and where the government barely controls its own capital. And the argument of Kenya is that, well, you know, people who have been lecturing us about refugees all these years are now sending them back. You know, why can't we do the same? We have our own concerns. So the bad example given by Western countries is already influencing countries that have been hosting refugees quite generously to date. Now, we went to Kenya because they decided to close the camp while saying that the return would be voluntary, and the UN agency has basically played ball with them and said, no, it is safe to go to Somalia. All the people want to go. We will help them. And they have boosted the package they give for people to return, therefore an incentive to return. And therefore the whole idea that is voluntary is absurd. And we wanted to go in Somalia and see, and what are the conditions for people who return. So we flew to Mogadishu, where we were told, you cannot go to Kismayo because it's far too dangerous. And we said, but this is what UNHCR is telling people they should go back to. So we decided to go, took our precautions and decided to go. And as you will see, my colleague Mark, this is the camp from the Dadaab camp, from where people have to go. And my colleague Mark, when we went to Kismayo, this is how we were in the plane. So we had no difficulties to find tickets to go to a place where the UN says refugees can go back, and where we are told, no, but you cannot go. So if they go back, how can we monitor what's happening to them? And clearly there were no conditions, neither on security nor on the capacity to recover normal life, that were present in Kenya. And this is something we've pushed very strongly with the US government here, who funds the UN agency, and with the UN agency at their headquarters in Geneva. The most recent crisis, Southern Sudan. So Southern Sudan has erupted in violence basically since its independence in 2011. The conflict was, for the most recent years, centered on the northeast part of the country, with many people being displaced within their country and many fleeing to Ethiopia or to Sudan. We have visited refugees in Ethiopia 2 years ago. We are planning next year to go to Sudan if we can get visas, which is still a difficult issue with Sudan. But the conflict has now spread in the south, in the area that you see in pink here. And you had, in the past few months, a tremendous number of refugees flowing into Uganda. There are at present about 600,000 refugees in Uganda. It's the most recent large-scale refugee outflow. And I have a team who's just spent 2 weeks down there and will be back in the office on Monday, who are looking at the conditions in which they were received. Now, traditionally, Uganda has been quite good to refugees, even as allowing them to grow their food and becoming self-sufficient. But one of the big concerns we had this time was to look at how people had survived their ordeal of flight. there is in southern Sudan an incredible level of horrendous violence against women, and we wanted to make sure that when people make it to Uganda, services were available for women who had been victims of abuse. So that a few months ago, the presidential guard assaulted in the capital of southern Sudan a hotel which hosted international humanitarian worker, and a couple of American humanitarian workers were raped by the Imperial Guard, by the Presidential Guard. You can imagine that this happens in the capital, a few blocks from the peacekeeping mission and the U.S. Embassy, what happens in the countryside when these army bands reach a village to the local population. This is what we're looking at. I do not have yet the results of what we found. I know they found that there was a tremendous amount of people who had been victims, and I'm waiting for their reports to see how is the UN, how are voluntary agencies responding to the needs of these women, and we will, of course, build our recommendations on their finding. We have also recently gone to Myanmar, Burma for others, to look at the long-term impact of the very severe floods that impacted the Rakhine state, and above Rakhine, you don't see it, but just about Rakhine, the Chin state, about a year ago. Now, a year ago, we went there to look at the emergency response and had identified some fairly severe shortcomings in the way the UN had responded, basically waiting for the government to ask for help rather than to try to help them. We have a new government that is still pretty much trying to set up its own working mechanism. Now, in the past, and it was certainly the case in the Philippines a year ago, what we found is that generally the immediate response to natural disasters tend to be better than the immediate response to conflict-related displacements. But the problem we have with natural disaster is as time passes, the midterm and long-term response is extremely weak. And what we wanted to look in Myanmar, this case, is how has the relocation of people who could not go back to the areas from which they had been displaced because the areas have been completely destroyed, and how is the recovery program being launched. And this is where we want to put much more attention in the future. And at the same time, we look at how is the government preparing itself for future disasters, and therefore how are they putting in place disaster risk reduction or mitigation measures. The only good thing, if I could say, about climate-related disasters is that the map of these disasters in the world is much more predictable than the map of conflict. Where will be conflict in 5 years? We don't know. But where these climatic disasters will happen, they tend to recur in the same areas. And therefore, we should put much more focus into the ability of governments to prevent a large-scale displacement and to certainly mitigate the impact of displacement on the families who have to move away. And just a couple of photographs to see how fields were completely destroyed and sort of collapse in the rivers when displacement occurs, and villages were completely flooded and abandoned. I have to move quickly on some of our other countries. Nigeria, in the northwestern state of Borno, Boko Haram, fundamentalist group with absolutely no scruples in how it treats the civilian population, has displaced millions of people in areas that have until very recently remained extremely inaccessible. We went there because there was very little coverage of the needs of this population, and because we had heard also, as was reported in the case of the Chibok girls, that Boko Haram tended to abduct many schoolgirls and make them their own servant wives, etc. And we wanted to see a little bit what is done for the people who managed to escape from Boko Haram. So we went on this mission very much with a focus on gender violence. And what we found was first a very poor coordination between the different members of the international community. Donors, the UN, and the international voluntary agencies were basically at odds with each other, which was quite a shocking discovery, and something that we brought back quite strongly to senior officials in New York when we came back from Nigeria. Some other issues were the very appalling conditions in which some of the displaced people had been. I mean, you see these makeshift places where they are living with a very irregular supply. I would say the only good news in this picture is the pole you can see with a light and a solar panel. This is a fairly simple technology that allows you to illuminate camps at night and do provide a certain amount of protection for women against abuse by guards in the camps, or even sometimes by other displaced person. And we are seeing this sort of apparel increasingly spread in camp, not sufficiently in my view, but it's a very interesting example of simple technology that can change things in camps. But that is perhaps one of the very few positive signs we saw down there. The most troubling sign, and I'm putting here the picture that the government puts on whom they suspect from making Boko Haram. These are just a band of fighters, but we found out that many of the girls which had been released from Boko Haram by army interventions were left completely without any assistance, certainly without psychological support, and in quite a few cases remained detained by the army on suspicion that they might have been radicalized. And a lot of the effort of my colleague who went down there was to make sure that the UN voluntary agencies would start developing a system of exchanging information with the army and a proper mechanism of reference for women who have suffered horrors and who, when they are released, are left completely on their own, if not detained. So certainly a tremendous weakness of the system down there in responding to what we would consider some of the foremost needs among displaced population. I have covered a few of the countries where we have visited last year. Let me tell you that we went to other countries. We went to Zimbabwe to look at the impact of the ongoing drought on possible future displacement at the time when the country is facing a tremendous governance crisis, as we know, because of the probably prompt demise of the president. And we were able to shake up a little bit how the UN is responding and make sure that more funds and more people are going to be mobilized to respond, hopefully in time to avoid displacement. We have gone to the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to look at the Burundi outflow. We have gone to Myanmar and Thailand to look at where the Rohingya minority was displaced from Myanmar last year, how they are treated, how they survive. So we've tried to cover, as you saw from that map, quite a few other places, but I can't discuss them all right now. 2016 was marked by a series of international events that were quite remarkable in that they were first in the past 50 years since the whole humanitarian mechanism were created. There was first a humanitarian meeting in Istanbul conveyed by the Secretary General to look mostly at the funding of international aid. Then at the General Assembly in September, the Secretary General conveyed a general summit on refugees and migration for a whole day. This has never happened before. And then the next day, President Obama conveyed a leadership summit at the General Assembly also in a slightly different format, which was a pay-to-play event where governments who were invited only if they were prepared to come with additional commitments. These meetings were important in that they recognized that we are short in the response we give to forced displacement today, and we need to find better measures. Plenty of ideas were discussed: how to increase humanitarian funding, how to provide more support to local civil society, how to involve development actors to make sure that people do not remain subject to humanitarian aid too long, but that very quickly they be given opportunity to generate their own ability to sustain themselves. How to increase burden sharing by bringing in perhaps the private sector, where it can provide some assistance by increasing resettlement. So all these were good ideas, and quite a few fairly creative measures have been spoken about. Now, unfortunately, in the final documents, of course, most governments tried to constrain the narrative of the results of these summits into merely a justification of what they are currently doing. And at the President Summit, for example, it was distressing to see that none of the European countries came with anything new, but Chad and Ethiopia, for example, made some reasonable commitments to improve things that they're doing in their own country. So a lot to follow up in years to come. And for RI, it certainly means that we will keep on showing what is missing in the response in the field, because all these nice talk at central level is going to take ages to materialize, if at all, and I think we'll have to keep on pushing. But at least now we have a couple of milestones that we need will matter. The member states of the UN have committed themselves to come with a global compact on refugees in 2 years. This is something that the new Secretary General will have to push, and thankfully he's the former head of the UN Refugee Agency, so he will, I would hope, have some interest in making sure this happens in the best possible terms, and will certainly make sure that the experience we gather from our field missions will be able to feed these discussions. And the next, of course, big challenge for us will be how do we engage a new administration that has not necessarily said the most reconforting things with regard to refugees and foreign aid. And my last slide will be about the missions we are planning to do next year. So some repeat of what did this year, and some or in the past years, and some new missions. On the potential ones, you see Afghanistan and Yemen. These have huge internal displacement crisis. In Afghanistan, there is an additional problem that the Pakistani government, again following what the Europeans are doing on their own area, have decided to send the Afghans remaining in Pakistan back, though there are no conditions in Afghanistan to receive them. The only concern with these two countries is mostly first to get visas, because they're very difficult to provide visas to go, but we're looking very seriously at the possibility to go there. And before I leave you and take your question, I would like to leave you on one last image. And these are the people who basically we work for them, and your support makes their life different. These are families who have left the areas around Mosul as the offensive of the Iraqi government against ISIS in Mosul is taking place. They are in extremely makeshift camps in northern Iraq, where assistance does not go well, and where we found that there was a majority of households headed by women, either because their husbands had been killed or because they had been detained for security clearance, and they have no access to them. They don't know what will happen to them. Sometimes they are detained because a relative was a member of ISIS, sometimes just because their name, which in the Islamic world is very often copies the name of someone else who was a suspect. So these women have to fare on their own to try to access the limited assistance that is available, to decide when to try to move back home, and how to make sure that their large families are being taken care of. So again, thank you very much for your attention. And as I said before, I would be delighted to answer your question. So I will read the question, because I'm not sure you can all read them. How do you plan to work with the Trump administration? It's a good question, because certainly we have some concerns, having read what some of the person he has picked for his administration have talked about refugees coming from Muslim countries in particular, how they've talked about foreign aid, and how some have talked about the UN. So we are concerned about the maintenance of US leadership in the future, which is key to the good functioning of the international humanitarian system. We are concerned about the relationship between the UN and the US. But we have decided to take a cautious approach. Some NGOs have taken a very aggressive approach, already making pretty strong statements. We've decided to wait and try to open a dialogue with the person we will be able to access in the administration, and then come with constructive criticism when we see that there are precise issues which we can try to change, rather than taking a more ideological view to begin with. Second question, does the UN have any mandate to intervene in IDP crisis? How do UN peacekeepers become involved? I am thinking specifically of the horrors of Syria. So yes, the UN has a divided mandate for IDPs. There has been an agreement that is about 10 years old now, where different UN agencies have different responsibilities for various sectors of assistance for IDPs, whether it's shelter or food or protection, healthcare, etc. So this has been created into a fairly complex mechanism that works more or less well, very often depending on who are the leaders of some of these agencies in the field. At the end, it's very often bottoms up on individual qualities, but it also depends on funding. And what we see is that refugee programs tend to be funded much more generously than programs for IDPs. If you look at the per capita funding that gets to these people, it's very, very, very different. And this is something we are trying to work on. It's IDPs tend to be the forgotten victims, while they represent 2/3 of people who are displaced by conflict. And the other part of the question was about the peacekeepers. Well, in Syria, you cannot send peacekeepers in a country without the consent of the government. That consent sometimes can be opened by a little bit of international pressure, but in the case of Syria, it would be impossible. I also doubt that there would be many countries that would be prepared to lend their battalions to the UN. The UN doesn't have its own battalions when they send peacekeepers. They do send battalions that are lent to them under the blue helmets by individual governments, and that is sometimes quite a difficult task. Let me see. Sorry. Sorry, which one? Where are his major accomplishment dealing with displacement in 2016? Well, I think certainly in Iraq, we have been able to attract the attention of the US government and the UN to the needs of displaced people in Anbar province in Iraq, in central Iraq. You have lots of people who have been displaced by ISIS. They are displaced in areas that are off access to most UN and US officials because of their security constraints. And my colleagues were able to travel there with local Iraqi voluntary NGOs and make sure that people in Baghdad were much more aware of what was going on and try to push for more resources to be given to those agencies who work there, who tend to be Iraqi agencies. That's certainly something we are proud of. In Zimbabwe, as I mentioned before, we have looked at how to avoid internal displacement because of the drought, and I think we have been able to mobilize for more personnel support from the UN, but also more assignation of resources by the US government. I have a few more examples I could mention. Certainly in the case of Nigeria, we got the Office of the UN Humanitarian Coordinator in New York to take much more seriously the dysfunction between the UN and the voluntary agencies. And this is something we want to follow up sometime next year to see how has it evolved right now. We have managed to increase the amount of humanitarian aid available for the Syrian crisis by about 400 million, and this is something that we tend to do quite successfully because we are independently funded and do not get any money from governments. When we push for an increase in appropriations on Congress knows that not a cent comes to RI, and that gives us a certain leverage when we ask for increase in humanitarian aid. Sorry, what and where is the focus of your climate refugee work? Well, I think we were the first humanitarian agency basically to raise the issue that displacement as a result of climate disasters is serious, is increasing, and is not met in the international community by the appropriate mechanism to respond, whether it's on legal terms of how to protect these people, particularly if they cross borders, because they would not qualify as refugees. And we have been so outspoken on these issues that my colleague who runs the program is the only NGO person that sits on platforms that had been established by governments to discuss this issue. It was initially called the Nansen process. It has now changed name, but we are the only NGO who brings back the aspect of displacement of population in climate discussion. So this is something that we are going to follow with pride, I must say. It's something we've inherited from my predecessors whose idea it was. And as I mentioned before, we also tried to focus very much on the longer term of displacement, which we found was the forgotten aspect. Emergency response, international community response well or not, but with the means it has. But when it comes to the midterm response, it tends to be extremely weak. And this is, of course, when the cameras are removed from the areas where people have been displaced. And this is where I think we can keep on making a major contribution. Let me keep on going down on the questions. Sorry, I think I've addressed all the questions that have been raised. Okay, well, if there are no more question, I want to thank you very much for your attention. Reiterate that your support is critical, and it is helping us to reach out to the persons that have been able to show you on some of these slides. So thank you very much, and I wish everybody a very happy holiday season. Thank you.